The clean technology industry is growing rapidly in Canada. In fact, I think Canada is acknowledged as a global leader in this area. But there are ways to accelerate that development. And one of them is to have the Canadian government change its procurement policies to favor domestic clean tech companies. And I'm going to be talking to John McNally, who's a research associate with Smart Prosperity Institute, who has recently authored a report called Building Better, Leveraging Federal Procurement to Drive Demand for Canadian Clean Tech. So welcome to the interview, John.
Thanks, Mark. I'm happy to be here.
Look, let's start with an overview of the study, please.
Sure. So for about 30 years now, we've been talking about the potential for federal procurement to really drive purchasing of clean tech in this country. There's been a lot of discussions about the need to reform government procurement and use it as a strategic tool to help advance Canada's environmental goals. And in the last 30 years, with all of this talk, we haven't made very much progress. So there's a need for us to sort of think a bit differently about how exactly we can help leverage this big opportunity to help really drive the purchase of environmentally friendly goods and services. This report focuses on the federal government's clean tech spending. The federal government is the country's largest buyer of goods and services. And the objective of the report is to break down the way that the federal procurement process works in an effort to help understand some of the bottlenecks to driving purchasing for clean technologies, and in turn, target recommendations specifically at addressing those bottlenecks in a way that can hopefully make some progress on this issue that's been stalled for a long time.
Would it be fair to say, John, that procurement is kind of low-hanging fruit in developing a sector like this?
I think it's fair to say, and my answer is probably yes and no. In some ways, procurement, I think, has a ton of potential. And one of the big challenges that we've run into in trying to make recommendations and advance this area in the past is that federal procurement is a little bit different than a number of other policy spaces, because it's not necessarily about thinking about the government as a mechanism for supporting or shifting the market, but thinking about the government as a customer. For companies to sell to. And that's a bit of a mentality shift. It requires us to think a lot about the value proposition and the kind of metrics they use in making decisions and a host of other things. So there's a lot of potential for federal procurement to really drive change. But in terms of it being low-hanging fruit, it kind of depends on how much you want to get into the weeds as to how some of the purchasing decisions are made. And that's ultimately, I think, what we ended up doing in this report and what a number of other reports have kind of come to the conclusion of as well.
If there's an opportunity here for the federal government to use procurement to develop clean tech, is there an opportunity to amplify that effect by bringing on the provinces, or at least some of the big provinces, to join the effort?
Absolutely. So 80% of procurement in Canada is done by municipal governments. I believe that's the stat. Apologies if it's not, but 80% of procurement in Canada is done by municipal governments. And ultimately, every level of government purchases things. The federal government is often viewed as being the one with the largest potential and also the hardest nut to crack. Because there's all of the established processes and so many players and so many actors involved that it can be difficult to figure out, it can be difficult to pilot new solutions. In terms of purchasing processes, and it can be difficult to get new ideas embedded into sort of the federal bureaucracy. But ultimately, changing the way that we think about procurement is really important to do across every level of government to help drive demand. And hopefully, some of the lessons that the federal government learns, should they choose to implement some of the recommendations we outline, can have really transferable learnings for other levels of government where they may not have the same kinds of resources to be able to implement these pilots.
Well, let's talk about a couple of the recommendations from your report. One is to extend current government pilot support programs to offer commercialization assistance to clean tech companies. What do you have in mind there?
So a lot of the time when the federal government works with clean technologies, they end up in sort of a fairly standard cycle, which is that they will take a new clean technology, they'll pilot it with a specific department. And then once the pilot is over, successful or not, there's often not a clear pathway to go from try to buy, where we go from sort of piloting this clean technology to actually implementing it into procurement decision-making. Now, that process means that oftentimes you will have gone through this entire exercise where there is a market, there is a buyer, and there is a seller identified, and they just can't quite connect the dots on how to sell with each other. So what we recommend is creating supports specifically aimed at helping some of these pilots and some of the technologies that have been piloted transfer over to the commercialization stage so that they can move from that pilot phase into actual government purchasing decisions once the department understands the technology, it's been de-risked, and there's a level of trust on both sides.
Let's talk about another one, which is helping Cleantech small and medium-sized enterprises build capacity to participate in federal procurement. And I've seen this in other areas where, Indigenous communities, for example, you ask them to do, say, apply for programs, and there isn't the capacity within that community, to write proposals or to do the research of resources available. And it sounds like this is very similar to that.
It is. So Cleantech is an interesting space because most Cleantech companies, or rather the Cleantech challenge is sort of this intersection of three different issues that procurement has historically struggled with. One is that it's fun, innovative, new, exciting technologies, which the procurement system is not necessarily designed to support. The second is it offers a big improvement in environmental performance, which isn't really accounted for in most procurement decision-making. But the third is that the majority of Cleantech companies in Canada are small to medium-sized businesses. Most small to medium-sized businesses don't have the internal capacity to be able to go through the formal grant writing process, to have someone who looks at RFP boards to fill out all of the applications and sort of go through the full process for these things. A lot of the companies that do have the resources to do that in-house are relatively specialized. That makes it challenging for your average Canadian Cleantech company to be able to participate in federal procurement. And actually, we identify a number of bottlenecks in the process being related to the fact that the RFPs that are being put out aren't necessarily suited to what the market is often kind of ready to provide in the context of like actually sort of getting involved. So the actual costs of contracting and the length of time and the amount of resources that are needed are often cited as big barriers for participating in federal procurement from companies on the ground. And so in our eyes, it makes sense to have a really targeted set of programs and recommendations aimed at helping build capacity within the small to medium-sized enterprise space for Cleantech so that they can start to engage with government more as a customer.
And finally, creating a buyers group open to adopting Cleantech post-pilot testing. What do you mean by that?
So if you're involved in procurement discussions at the federal level, one of the models that often gets cited is this cool, exciting one called CAN Health. CAN Health CAN does not stand for Canada. It's Coordinated Access Network Health. And what it is it's a buyers group that exists to help support companies and networks of buyers in what they call the pre-procurement phase. So the idea is that they help companies better understand some of the needs of government to sort of help be able to sell to them, and they help governments understand what the Canadian marketplace is like, so that when they're actually thinking about putting together a request for proposal, they have an understanding of what the market can provide, and they can sort of work together to try and figure out some of these other pieces. Because it's all pre-procurement, and it's basically information sharing and communication, there's absolutely no problem involved with any of this. It's just about helping everyone involved prepare a little more for the kinds of bids they want to put out and thinking a bit about what they want to do. This has proven to be really successful in Canada. And there's a number of companies that have sort of been able to sort of take this and have grown using procurement as a big driver. So when we talk about creating a buyers group, well, that is essentially what we mean is we want to help. We think it would be really useful to develop a program that aimed to do some of the capacity building, information communication, information sharing, help sort of develop bids together that we've seen be really effective in the health technology space and apply it to Cleantech.
Now, John, when you were doing your research for this study, was there any indication that this issue is on the federal government's radar?
It is very much on the federal government's radar. It is, like I said, I think the last 30 years, it's one of those issues that comes up again and again and again. And virtually every big economic report that comes out talking about all of the policies that could be put forward to help support pretty much any policy goal talks about the potential for procurement to really drive change. And so what myself and what the two authors of this report, Teslan Augustin and Harshini Ramesh, we're able to sort of try and do is think a bit about what some of the challenges were that we were hearing expressed on the part of the Cleantech sector, on the part of government, on the part of other industry folks, on the part of researchers and civil society, and try and more readily understand the landscape, what had sort of impeded progress on this in the past. And our hope is that the recommendations we put forward can be sort of very specific and very targeted to help sort of work with the procurement system where it's at right now, and hopefully make some progress towards meeting our 2030 climate target, which is coming up pretty soon.
Well, John, thank you very much for this. Appreciate your insights.
Thanks, Markham. Thanks for having me.